camera for a physical security buyer, but then you take $300 of that camera and give it to merchandising because there's a tremendous amount of value for them in a retail operation to see where the heat mapping is of the traffic flow for their, for their customers in the store. You can look at it as a revenue generating component for parking lots, right? Things like that, right? So the idea that the entire burden of the cost of physical security is on physical security, traditional buyer is just out the window. We just don't play in that world anymore. It can't, right? Businesses can't afford to do that anymore because it can't be a cost center.
Let me make one comment on that. So I would say that if you spent the time actually looking at the numbers in the amount that you would save in loss prevention, to give the retail example, right? The amount you'd save in loss prevention versus, with a higher definition camera versus the amount of customer base that you'd gain with the analytics knowing how many people were in line, how many customers came in and out of a store, what aisles they went down, so on and so forth. You're almost you far sort of outweigh the benefit in terms of how much you gain than you stand to lose, right? So if that makes any sense, the amount of loss prevention you're going to reduce versus the amount of customer knowledge that you're going to gain, the loss prevention part almost becomes a much smaller part of the overall solution, right? It's less valuable to get less loss prevention than it is to get more customer insight, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, that's a good place to break from our first segment here, and I just remind everyone that you are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Lafreri. We ask you to subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So segment 2, talking about the logistics of of how this new disruptive technology platform is going to be implemented, or is likely to be implemented. So is the industry moving to a turnkey, cloud-managed video communications infrastructure inclusive of analytics to detect and classify and route video all at the edge?
Well, yeah, of course it is. We wouldn't be here otherwise.
Next question.
After a long question like that, we get a yes.
Matt, let me jump in for
please,
a
go
quick
ahead.
second. So I think the baseline has moved up quite a bit, right? The old baseline for video surveillance was, does it record video in a quality good enough for me to determine what happened, right? Like that was sort of the baseline for every video surveillance decision. Now that baseline has moved up to, how well does it detect vehicles and people? How well can I search through video to find an incident? How easy is it for my officers and my operators to actually do those things without having to go through hours and hours of training and retraining every time there's a new version out, so on and so forth? Because that baseline has moved up so much, you'd be really hard pressed to find a customer that looked at a Meraki video surveillance solution and said, you know what? I prefer what I used to have. I'd prefer to have a mix of camera vendors and NVRs and hard drives I've got to upgrade and people I've got to train. And, so it's very rare that you find a customer. I've actually never encountered one that has said, you know what, I think I'm going to stick with the old school way of doing it, right?
Probably the guy that didn't upgrade the box for 10 years.
right, exactly. It's probably the same guy. He was the only one. But I think because that baseline has moved so much, I mean, with a Meraki camera system, if you wanted to do vehicle detection, for instance, you want to know how many people are in the parking lot behind this building, you'd put up a camera, you'd point it at the parking lot. That's it. You're done. You could log on right now and see how many cars are in the parking lot. It would just automatically figure out how many vehicles it could see. It gets better with machine learning. And if it does that out of the box, you'd be really hard pressed to compare that to a solution that was far more complicated with way more components and vendors and integrators and so on and so forth to get to that same baseline. So because that baseline has shifted so much, it's hard to ignore. It's really hard to not want to at least start at that point. Now, will there be customers who need more power or corner cases or very specific analytics? Sure. And we're meeting more and more of those cases every day with our ecosystem partners and some of the integrations we're doing. But since that baseline has moved up so much, there's so many more customers in the industry now that can take advantage of what we do out of the box without having to, sort of do all of these other parts, right? The technology becomes more available to the masses, so to speak.
So some of our listeners have spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on existing infrastructure, some, in many cases, very large scale video management systems and whatnot. And they're listening to this and going, oh boy, I got this huge investment out there, and I do have, a culture of an understanding and an acceptance of support of it. And I'm listening to what's, you're talking about for the future. What would you say to those clients that have that legacy, big, large deployed topology and are looking at this? Is this a forklift replacement? Is there a transition here? What would those customers, those enterprise customers, do that would be wise given the legacy investment they've got?
I'm going to let Matt answer that, but I would say to those same folks, I own a number of Blu-rays and a Blu-ray player. But when Netflix came out, I moved to Netflix like everybody else did. Why wouldn't I? Right? When the technology became available and was a better consumption model, I still had all of those, that investment in Blu-rays. I had a ton of them, right? And I still had the investment in this thing, but the delivery mechanism changed. And the thing that I wanted, right, was just to be able to watch more movies. Because that shifted, my care about shifted. I no longer cared about having like the best quality, video experience. I cared a lot more about, well, what is the user experience like? How do I get access to more stuff? I still have those Blu-rays, but I haven't opened up any of those cases in years, right? I just use Netflix. So, it was the right technology decision at the time, but as sort of the industry moves forward, it's unstoppable, right? You sort of have to adapt with that process.
Yeah. And going back to the question, Jim, I mean, we do understand that there has been a tremendous amount of infrastructure built over the years, right? I mean, you sold a lot of them right here in the tri-state area, right? As well as myself. Meraki is not, blind to that component, right? So they've built the video surveillance experience the way that Matt has just described to ride on that existing infrastructure. I mean, back in the day when cameras were installed, in any kind of construction site, hands down, the lion's share of that cost was the infrastructure build, right? Just pulling the cable to the camera probably costs over 50% of the cost of the camera. Very expensive. We've identified that as well, but with a cloud or edge-based solution similar to Meraki itself, the idea of an entire forklift is just foreign. It doesn't work. We have to be able to build on infrastructures. IP in general is kind of a blanket, if you will, for standards that we can easily plug a camera into and then gain a better experience just from the installation alone. As soon as you plug in a Meraki camera, it finds it and provisions itself on the camera, is secured, and starts recording the way Matt described in the parking lot scenario as well. And that is absolutely the case with any of your customers' existing infrastructure, whether it's coaxial, kid you not, or IP, we can plug a Meraki camera to it. In the world of coaxial, we actually use that for power instead. And since Meraki was built on a wireless cloud solution, the camera can be viewed over your Wi-Fi network. So again, no more infrastructure needs to be built to do something like this. If you're going to take advantage of an infrastructure, you can.
So one of the things that obviously as an end user, we always thought that we get worried about it, or concerned about is we talk about cyber attacks and the risk of all of the devices that are online and and all of that sort of good stuff. So what's Cisco's plan on being able to? Is this something that's built in on the edge device that you're going to be able to insulate the communications?
Yeah, sure. I'll grab that one. So there's a lot of ways to answer that, right? Because there are a lot of things that Cisco's doing. Different customers have different components, and we need to be able to cover all use cases. So on the camera itself, right, the way that we're building these camera systems today is they are essentially, self-contained video. Each camera is sort of its own self-contained video surveillance system. A single camera or two cameras or 10,000 cameras do not necessarily affect each other in terms of uptime or things like that. Each one of those cameras has chip-level security so that even if you were to get a hold of the camera, the physical camera, you would not be able to see the video that was on that camera. You could not alter the firmware on that camera. You couldn't get access to it, right? And this is not done in software. This is literally done in hardware, a chipset level layer of security that we put on the physical device. When it comes to actually accessing that stream, all of those streams are encrypted. The login mechanisms, we can use two-factor login mechanisms, but because there's less components to secure, there's sort of this natural ability to be more secure, right? There's less things that you have to guard because everything is encrypted, because the endpoints are encrypted. Even that video stream to your browser when you're viewing that video, that whole entire process is encrypted. And that's just the video surveillance system, not to mention the actual attachment of that system to the network. So one of the things that Meraki's come out with pretty recently is this concept of Secure Connect. And this right now is a Meraki access point to Meraki switch technology. But basically the way that it works, it's going to be ported over to other things eventually, including the camera system. But basically the way that it works is there is a certificate exchange between the endpoint and the network before that device even gets a DHCP address, right? Before you even allow that device to join the network to then determine if it's safe or not. Meraki on Meraki has this ability to say, hey, do you belong to this network? Do you belong to this customer? Does this customer own both switch and camera? And if the answer is yes, those devices can talk to each other. So the example being, if I took if I owned a Meraki camera and walked into your building and unplugged your Meraki camera and plugged in my Meraki camera, on most systems it would say, okay, it's another Meraki camera. I assume this one is safe to join the network. With ours, the direction we want to head with this concept of Secure Connect is the system would say, this may be a valid device, but it's not my device. I don't know who this device is, and the certificate doesn't match my certificate. So I'm not even going to let it on the network, let alone allow it to connect and configure and so on and so forth like most other devices would. And that is just scratching the surface of conversations like adaptive policy without getting too technical and without getting into too many details. It's basically a way of grouping devices on your network to say, hey, security people should be able to talk to security devices. Building people should be able to talk to IoT devices. Folks that manage both of those things, IT should be able to talk to both, but someone in marketing or sales shouldn't have access to those systems. And it really is as simple as that, drawing a box around a group of devices and saying, these devices can talk to those devices. And not necessarily mapping those things to, well, this device, so long as it's plugged into this port with this IP address on this network, can't talk to, whatever its counterpart is. That concept is just too complicated for most people to deploy, so they don't do it. Not to mention, if anyone ever unplugs that device and plugs it in somewhere else, it doesn't work. And now someone's got to reconfigure this whole thing. This concept of adaptive policy is supposed to smooth all of that out to make security sort of automatic. And that is that's, again, like we were talking about earlier, that is the easiest way to get to the answer, right? If we can simplify it, automate it, and make security just something that happens, not something that you have to do.
Well, that's a good lead in then for the third segment, where we'll get into a little bit more the details of that Meraki topology and how you manage that, maintain that security with the simplicity. You are listening to the Risk Advisor podcast, hosted by myself, Jim Henry, and Sal Frary. We ask that you subscribe and follow us on our social media like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are interested in having one or both of us speak at an upcoming event or would like to consult with us, please go to our webpage at theriskadvisor.com to set that up. So we've tossed around the name Meraki here a few times, both from the brand and the topology, but maybe you can give us a little retrospect here as to the lineage of Meraki and why did Cisco acquire it? What's your plan for it? How are you taking it to market?
Well, you're going to get two different perspectives, actually, from the acquisition of Meraki. I mean, both Matt Shaner and I started at Cisco kind of together. He left, went to Meraki, and I stayed at Cisco, and then he came back to Cisco. So we'll start with we'll let Matt start first, because the perception from coming into Cisco is just as important as us acquiring it. So go ahead, Matt.
Sure. I think when Cisco first acquired Meraki, there was, at least internal to Meraki, there was a lot of worry, right? Like what parts of this platform is Cisco going to take, dismantle, take bits of technology and put it in other things. But what Cisco, pretty quickly realized is Meraki was something really special in the industry. There really wasn't any other player focused on this concept of just making things simple, right? But back then in 2012, when we were acquired, the industry was really focused on how many more knobs could you have? How many more switches? How many more dials? How many more features? And we noticed that the more you talk to customers, they get overwhelmed by all of these things they've got to learn and buttons they've got to press. And there was a huge niche forming of customers saying, like, can't you just make it easy? Can't you just give me one button where I click the thing and the thing does the thing? Like, that's all I really want. I don't want to have to do all of these crazy things to get to the end goal. So like any good startup, right? We started with, somewhat of a minimum viable solution that met enough customer need where we could build some momentum. And then you look at where we've come since then, and it's a total different product line, right? Now we're as competitive as any other major enterprise networking vendor out there, with product lines in wireless and switching and firewall and mobile device management and cameras and cellular and soon to be more exciting product lines, which I won't tease quite yet, but keep an eye out. There's more stuff to come. So I think Cisco realized that they had the ability to have both, right? Cisco can still have their traditional feature-rich, powerful pieces of equipment, and they can also have the sort of the opposite of that, the still powerful but much more simpler to deploy and integrate with. And And I think Cisco's happy there, right? Like we're happy having two horses in this race where we get to have both. And customers like choice and customers like both, and they're both